All right. Thanks very much for coming here tonight, comrades. As was mentioned, it's 100 years ago this week, actually, that the Great Strike of 1917 was taking place. Actually, there would have been a lot of discussion and debate that took place in this very building here, Trades Hall in Melbourne. It would have been a centre of some of the activities, at least here in the state of Victoria. I mean, for people that don't know, in many respects, the Great Strike of 1917 was probably the most intense period of class struggle that Australia has ever seen. It encompassed all up over 100,000 workers, or around 100,000 workers, and it lasted in total more than 2 months. The strike was no doubt a major class confrontation. On the one side, you had the most important sections of the working class facing off against the combined forces of the state and the capitalists themselves. But, I mean, unfortunately we have to say, despite the determination of the workers, the strike was unfortunately defeated. So 100 years on, we're having this meeting, I mean, yes, to commemorate the events and to look into it, but it's not just out of historical interest for us, because for socialists, for Marxists intervening in the trade union movement, the Great Strike holds a lot of lessons that the labour movement will be able to, will need to draw upon in future battles. Now, this was a strike that took place in the midst of World War I. When the war began in many countries, including in Australia, there was a patriotic mood that developed in the first instance. But as the death toll mounted, as bodies started coming home, the mood began to change. People's attitudes began to change. But also the economic conditions of the time played a big role in transforming the situation and transforming people's views. Here in Australia, you saw inflation and prices rise dramatically. You saw profiteering by the capitalist class. The workers were really being asked to pay through the nose. And as wages and living conditions were being undermined, workers were asked more and more to shoulder the war effort. In 1916, so just a year before the strike, the government actually suffered a very significant blow. They actually lost a referendum on the issue of conscription. Now, this actually provided a big boost to the labour movement at the time, who were the main ones that led the campaign for a no vote. So in this period, in these months, you started to see the patriotism waning somewhat, and it was giving way to a certain radicalisation that was taking place, a new mood of militancy, if you like. And people were moving slowly but surely to try and recoup some of the financial losses that they had suffered in the previous years. 1916, just a year before the strike, saw a huge increase actually in strike activity, with over 1.7 million workdays lost. This, up until that time in Australian history, that was the highest ever level of strikes recorded. Now, this issue of conscription, which was a hot issue of the day, it actually split the ruling Labor Party, with the Prime Minister Billy Hughes leaving the party, being kicked out of the party, and moving on to form a new nationalist government. In New South Wales, the state government there, you had another former Labor leader called William Holman, and he had just recently come to power. Now, like Billy Hughes, Holman had been expelled from Labor, and he went on to join with the right-wing Liberals to form the Socialist Party. Now, these two guys, obviously now avowed anti-Labor men, they were pretty keen to strike a blow to the trade union movement, as they saw the trade unions as being responsible for the conscription defeat, and they were looking to seek some revenge. Now, it was sort of during these very tumultuous times that the Great Strike of 1917 first kicked off. The spark for the first outbreak of the strike was ignited in the Randwick and the Everleigh railway workshops in inner city Sydney. Now, at the time, these were two of the biggest workplaces in New South Wales and probably in the whole of Australia. These were state-owned railways at that particular time, and what they wanted to do was introduce what they called a card system, a new card system. These cards would be used to record basically like time and motion studies of the workers, and the workers in these railway workshops correctly perceived them as a way for the bosses to try and attempt to speed up their work and to exercise more control over what they were doing. Now, there was no doubt that the government was keen to, strike a blow to the unions, to weaken the unions, but also they wanted to try and cut across, or they were very wary of cutting across, a new revolutionary mood and revolutionary ideas that were developing at this point in time. As I've explained, there was massive movements around the conscription issue. People were becoming disillusioned with the war effort and so on. And at that point in time, you actually had a situation where the industrial workers of the world, the syndicalist organisation, were like a household name. They'd actually just been banned in 1917, just prior to the strike. But their radical pitch, their revolutionary ideas, they still held some sway. Basically, they promoted direct action, and they were very much opposed to the war, probably the most prominent group that was opposed to World War I. At that time, you also had a situation where the railways, the state-owned railways, were running at a loss. Now, this was mostly due or because of rising interest rates on commercial loans as a result of the war. But the Railway Commissioner considered, obviously, that he could do little about the interest rates, but there was a few other things that he could do. He increased fares, he increased freight costs, and he was looking to reduce labour costs by introducing this card system and essentially trying to speed up the work. Now, the workers saw this as just yet another attempt, after all the burdens that they'd been suffering, another attempt to shift the costs of the war onto them, and they weren't going to have any of it. Now, at this point in time, when this dispute was, when the foundations for this dispute were being laid, the trade union leaders were actually looking to make a compromise with the bosses and with the state government. But the workers, on the other hand, were actually preparing for a fight. Now, they took matters into their own hands on August 2, actually it was, by refusing to cooperate with the card system in the railway yards. On that day, it was led by the metal workers from Randwick and Everleigh railway workshops. They actually took about 5,700 people out on strike on that day. Relatively modest number, but little did they know that act of rank and file militancy was about to have very widespread ramifications. Now, while the railway workers obviously had concerns about this card system and so on, the strike actually spread like wildfire outside of the railway workshops into many other industries, and I think that says something about the general mood that existed in society at that point in time. In reality, this card system, which can seem like a very minor thing, was really the straw that broke the camel's back. And this great strike of 1917 was really an expression of the widespread discontent that existed in society as a whole during the First World War. Now, the first group of workers to support, the metal workers and others were first to come out in the railway yards, but the first group of workers to come in behind them were the fuelmen. Now, these were the people that loaded the coal onto the trains. All the coal that was held by the Railway Commissioner was declared by the strikers to be black. The idea that other union members would touch black coal, that was they wouldn't touch black coal, that was the main way that the strike spread. People were not prepared to touch black goods, and they were not prepared to work with scabs. Obviously, in that time, 100 years ago, there wasn't that many cars around, to be honest, and rail was the main form of transportation. And all of the industries that relied on the railway networks, they were the first to be hit. So the first thing that happened was the reduction in rail services that took place because of the strike. That straight away affected the coal mines, and it also affected the wharfs. The waterside workers themselves refused to load black coal onto the ships, and many workers in other industries, because the main way they got to work often was to catch the trains, they refused to get on scab trains and to go to work at all. So in the first few weeks of August, the strike gained significant momentum. The stoppages by the wharfies, because they wouldn't load the coal, that spread to the entire waterfront, and all the waterside workers there were involved. By mid-August, waterside workers and seamen in both Queensland and also down here in Victoria had also stopped work. Now, employers attempted to try and replace some of these striking workers with scabs, but really that just inflamed the tensions that already existed and actually, forced the strike to spread even further. So unionists were continuing to boycott black goods, and they were continuing to refuse to work with scabs. Now, in the first instance, as I mentioned before, the union leaders were really angling for some type of compromise, and at the start, many of them did not support the strike at all. In fact, a whole number of them did their utmost really to try and prevent it from going ahead. Throughout the whole dispute, they were desperate for a resolution, and they didn't want things to escalate. But really, they were facing a tinderbox situation, as I say. The workers had had enough, and they were hell-bent on resisting the government and the boss's offensive. Now, the workers really had to drag the union leaders kicking and screaming into this dispute. And they did. They managed to get them to come and to lead the strike. And they hoped that once they were there, once that they were involved, they would carry out their responsibilities and do a proper job. Now, what happened was there was this thing called a defence committee was set up that was composed of leading officials from different unions, and that was the body that was established to coordinate the strike and actually to also negotiate with the government. Now, while the strike did have an official leadership, one of the most incredible aspects of this whole dispute was the level of initiative that was taken from the ranks. I mean, time and time again, the workers actually didn't wait for the defence committee. They didn't wait for the union leaders to come out to the jobs. They just had their own meetings. They called, mass meetings. They passed resolutions, and they decided to walk off the job on their own. In this, by the second and the third weeks of August, in addition to shipping being paralysed, which was definitely the case, the strike had even spread to many rural areas. Manufacturing workers, meat workers, storemen, packers, drivers, the whole lot had all stopped work alongside tens of thousands of others. It's estimated that more than 2.5 million workdays were lost during the course of the Great Strike. Now, while I suppose you'd have to say it wasn't really at the extent of a full-on, all-out general strike, we must say that all of the key sectors of the economy were affected. Obviously, New South Wales was the centre of the strike, which is why in some history books and some commentators refer to it as the New South Wales general strike, but really it was right across the whole eastern seaboard, and even some reports of strikes taking place in the west, in Perth, in Fremantle, and so on. There was huge meetings that took place during the course of this strike on a daily basis, actually, particularly at the Domain in Sydney and down here on the Yarra Banks in Melbourne. Mid to late August actually saw in excess of 100,000 people attend a number of protests at the Domain on several occasions. Now, it wasn't just workers and their families, they obviously attended these protests, but other people joined in, like anti-war protesters and others. And at the time, these protests were recorded as the biggest mass mobilisations of people that Australia had ever seen. So the strike was ascending right throughout August, and the government was keen to do whatever they could do to try and stem the tide. So what they did was they stepped up their efforts to recruit more and more scabs. All of the main newspapers ran ads and articles promoting, encouraging people to scab. They set up, bureaus in all the main towns and cities to recruit scabs. The newspapers had a huge effort to try and ramp up the propaganda campaign where they called the strikers unpatriotic. They claimed that they were undermining the war effort and so on. The government really appealed, the social base they were appealing to was really the middle class, conservative types from rural areas, and more backwards elements of the working class itself. They were trying to call upon those people to fill the jobs of the strikers. And it must be noted that there was many students from prestigious universities, but also from private high schools that were used to actually help break the strike as well, middle class kids. Both the government and the employers, they sort of encouraged scabs to join this effort by pledging to keep them on after the strike, and they also said to the workers, to the strikers themselves, if you don't come back to work, you risk losing your job, or at the very least you're going to be demoted, you could lose certain benefits, so on and so forth. The government set up camps to recruit scabs, particularly in Sydney, in places like Taronga Park, but also at the Sydney Cricket Ground, the SCG, which the workers and the strikers themselves nicknamed the Scab Collecting Ground for the SCG. Many of these scabs were sent to work on the waterfront, and others were deployed in the mines, because the mines were actually a key area as far as the government were concerned. They really wanted to maintain the supply of coal, because all the trains, most of industry and so on was heavily reliant on coal at that point in time, and they wanted to ensure that it continued to run. So during this dispute, you had all of the forces of the establishment, all of the forces of the state mobilised against the strikers, against the trade union movement. The government actually, this is hard to think of because it hasn't happened in a very, very long time, but the government actually enrolled hundreds of special constables. They issued them with revolvers, and they were deployed to assist the police operations. There was a whole number of street skirmishes that took place between scabs and striking workers, and there were occasions where things got very, very ugly. The most famous incident is the one where there was a scab by the name of Reginald Warren, and he shot two striking workers during a confrontation. One of the workers, called Mervyn Flanagan, he died as a result of his gunshot wound, while his mate, Henry Williams, was wounded quite badly. And disgracefully, Warren, who was actually the brother of a grub nationalist politician, ended up getting off the charges of murder and so on the grounds of self-defence. This whole family was actually instrumental in, the scabbing effort and all sorts of things during this dispute. They ramped up repression around this point in time as well, where they arrested 3 of the trade union leaders that were on the Defence Committee. And this was despite the fact, actually, that these guys had played a role to try and prevent the strike from going ahead initially. They were actually charged with conspiracy to incite the action. But workers continued to join the strike all the way up to the start of September, so for the whole month of August. And it was around the start of September, actually, that the government actually cut off all negotiations with the Defence Committee and actually declared it an illegal organisation. Now, it was at this point in time, unfortunately, that the Defence Committee basically capitulated and agreed to adjourn indefinitely, and they proposed there and then that the strike be called off. But despite the strike, the call for the strike to be called off being made, it took many, many weeks actually for the workers to actually return to work. People might have seen on the Facebook event page for this meeting that there's footage there of mass meetings in the Domain, and one of them is the meeting where they're putting this resolution to the strikers, and all you can see is thousands and thousands of hands being put up to vote no. That people were not interested in going back to work. They wanted to continue this dispute. So the attitude of the leaders was vastly at odds with the workers. As I say, most of them wanted to keep the strike going. But to take this whole dispute further, actually, would have meant a real showdown with the government. I mean, any further escalation would have posed the question of who really rules, which class rules in this society. Now, there was no doubt that the government went into this dispute very well prepared, and the union leaders, as I've mentioned, had to be dragged into this dispute kicking and screaming, and they had no discernible strategy to win. These union leaders were sort of, if you like, schooled in the art of arbitration, and they saw their role as merely negotiating within the framework of the capitalist system. Negotiating within the framework of the arbitration system that had been set up. They had no conception of challenging the system itself. So from their point of view, When they saw no way forward, they were prepared to retreat, even if it meant a major setback for the movement. Now, the Defence Committee recommended a return to work wholly on the government's terms, which meant in the railways the total acceptance of the card system. Now, obviously, as I say, the workers considered this an outright capitulation. But the union leaders, they tried to sell this sellout. They told people that there was no way to win. They said that it was the wrong timing and so on and so forth. Now, while the strikers were very reluctant to give up, actually, you had a situation where once the leadership abandons the struggle, certain sections of workers are sort of goaded into going back to work, and it's very, very quickly, actually, without decisive leadership, you can see a situation being turned around. So it was clear after this capitulation that the tide had turned, and a whole number of workers did start going back to work, and that was seen as a bit of a green light. Obviously, the bosses saw that in the railways that there had been a victory for the government, and they sought to replicate that victory in all of in private industry and so on. Obviously, some employers tried to tell workers that they were not even going to get their jobs back. They just replaced them with scabs. And that was the type of thing, the type of punishment that they meted out. Some of the union leaders, when they were trying to sell this rotten deal, they suggested that the timing of the strike was wrong, that the government was well prepared, we weren't, so on and so forth. The government had actually stockpiled coal. Now, it seems to me from reading into this or whatever that it's true, there was coal that was stockpiled, but I think what's way more important is the fact that there was, the loading of the coal by scabs was not stopped. Obviously, you had a situation where the workers had withdrawn their labour. But as I say, scabs were filling some very, very crucial gaps. The government actually desperately needed to maintain the supply of coal, as I say, for industry, which was key, but also for exports. Now, if the supply of coal was stopped or even hindered in a significant way, that would have seen the economy being stalled quite significantly, and then you would have had the ability to turn the tables on the government. But as I say, to do this would have required a strategy to deal with the mass scabbing effort that the government, the police and so on were carrying out. Now, as I say, tens of thousands of people were rocking up to protest in the Domain, at the Yarra Banks and so on, but at no stage did these union leaders, did the Defence Committee or whatever, call on those people to be mobilised at mass pickets to stop the scabs from loading the coal and from doing the work of the strikers. Now, obviously, it would have been very difficult to picket every single workplace, but it definitely would have been possible to organise pickets at key centres of economic activity, the wharfs, the coal mines, so on and so forth. So it's clear that the scabbing effort actually did have a major impact on the dispute, and the trade union leaders totally underestimated this. Now, while no strike victory is assured, it's very possible that a more militant approach to the scabbing effort could have turned the situation around. There was also no plan in place to spread the strike, to strengthen it, to escalate the situation. As far as it did happen, it was largely the result of rank and file self-initiative and spontaneity. Now, obviously these issues were a significant problem, but they really could have been overcome by a more far-sighted leadership. The strike took place actually at a very important time in world history. This was when revolutionary upheavals were happening all around the world. I mean, the February Revolution had just happened in Russia only a few months before, and 2 months after this strike had concluded, after the railway workers had gone back to work anyway, the October Revolution in Russia actually ushered in the first real the parliament. Now, when you're getting involved in a mass strike, this brings the union movement into the realm of actually national and international affairs. But the leaders, the trade union leaders, the Defence Committee, they did not really consider that they had a role to play over and above the basic issues of wages, conditions, the card system, and so on. I mean, in 1917, the politics of the workers' movement in Australia was basically lacking in depth. The immaturity of the socialist movement meant that these reformist trade union leaders, they basically faced no concerted challenge to their rule. The most prominent revolutionary group at the time, as I say, was the IWW, and they'd been banned a few months earlier and in a way largely smashed. At that stage, you need to remember the Communist Party had not been formed yet. So the best militants, the best revolutionaries of the day were sort of lacking in political direction, and they were lacking in political cohesion. The defeat of the strike, actually, what it did though, was it forced many of these militants to reassess their politics and to reassess the way in which they organised. A new debate actually opened up in the aftermath of this strike. And many positive things actually came out of the defeat. I mean, it actually took until the first week of December for the last of the striking workers to return to work. And going back was a very, very bitter experience for many. As I say, scab workforces had been established in many workplaces, and actually thousands of trade unionists were victimised as a result of the action that they took. But the strike itself had a very, very long-lasting impact on the consciousness of all those who participated in it and all those families and communities that were connected to it. I mean, on the industrial front, after this strike was defeated, immediately, so the year after, in 1918, there was a bit of a lull as far as industrial activity was concerned. But we must say that things actually turned around in a very spectacular way in 1919, about a year after this strike had finished. In that year, that was after, as the war was finishing, and the union movement was able to take advantage of much improved or relatively improved economic conditions that were opening up. And in 1919, actually, you had the number of workdays that were lost due to strikes actually surpassed that of what took place in 1917 itself. While there were some unions that took years to recover, we must register that, but there was others that actually sprung back into activity relatively quickly. And as I say, there was a shift and a lot of positives that came out of this strike, and really there was a shift to the left in politics and in the trade union movement itself. I mean, the period after the strike, there was a whole number of union elections that took place, and there was a whole number of incidents where the old, more conservative leaders were swept aside and replaced with younger, more militant leaders. For example, in New South Wales, a group that became known as the Trades Hall Reds, they took over the Labor Council up there. I mean, in reality, we have to say that the Great Strike of 1917 was really a key turning point which led to the growth of a new and a more militant mood in the Australian trade union movement, as well as a shift towards socialist ideas, actually. I mean, on the back of the successful Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917, the Communist Party was established in Australia a few years later in 1920. And what you'd have to say is that move was really an affirmation of the weaknesses of both the ideas of reformism, which were tested during the Great Strike, and the ideas of syndicalism, which were tested with the rise and then fall of the IWW. The Labor Party was also affected by this rise of socialist ideas, by this radicalisation that was taking place, and they themselves adopted their own, albeit limited, socialist objective in 1921. Now, I think while we have to obviously say that ultimately the Great Strike was unsuccessful, but really it must be noted down as one of the truly incredible events and one of the highlights of Australian working class and trade union history. It really proved to be an extremely formative process, and it showed the potential that the working class has under capitalism. Because when workers stop work en masse, society grinds to a halt. That was shown very, very clearly in 1917. And if that power can be harnessed, and if a revolutionary lead can be given, the working class really has the ability to sweep aside capitalism and usher in a new democratic socialist society that truly represents their interests. Obviously, comrades, that particular perspective was not realised in 1917, but I think part of what we're trying to discuss here tonight is understanding the lessons from that strike, making sure that they're absorbed into the current day labour movement so they can be built upon and looked upon once again in all the future battles that we're about to face. I'll leave it there, but thanks very much for coming along.